The story of Gatsy Rice is a very inspirational story from our own Lee County that we need to know to understand history. Gatsy Rice was an African-American woman who accomplished great things, like owning property, lending money, and running stable businesses. Her parents were both enslaved, and she was born enslaved in New Orleans. She was likely sold apart from her family at the age of 13, and she traveled alone with Alicia Milton to Auburn, Alabama in 1845 to be Alicia's nanny. Because she was enslaved, we do not know her exact birth date or how old she was when she passed, but we do know that she passed around the age of 70 and was born around 1832. As an enslaved person, Gatsy Rice was able to take advantage of the skills she learned during her enslavement, such as sewing and cooking, when she was free from slavery. She went on to use these skills to pursue her own career. Throughout her life, Gatsy Rice ran a boarding house by the modern-day Methodist Church on Magnolia Street for college cadets, and worked as a seamstress and laundress there. She formed many relationships here with the white community in order to keep her business thriving and have enough money to survive. Although respected more than the majority of African Americans in the South, Gatsy Rice still faced discrimination head-on. Gatsy Rice was a widowed mother of a son and daughter by the names of Willie and Nancy. Her belongings and her loans throughout her life are evidence that she had a financially stable career. She owned 2 houses in Auburn and a house in Opelika, alongside a 243-acre plot of land near the modern-day Tuskegee area. She also made a couple of loans in her life, such as a $672 loan to the Carr family for their farm mortgage. At one point, she also loaned $10 to a man by the name of H.K. Quillen. This amount of money was rare and difficult at this time for a black woman to have. This makes us confident that she was a financially well-off and hard-working woman. She also was a very generous woman to loan so much of her money away to help others. With the death of Gatsy Rice, the rumors of her being poorer than she was arose. This shows that during this time period, the South wanted to degrade the success of African Americans to maintain white supremacy. But when you look for the truth, she was actually a prominent, rich black woman. Upon her death, she chose to be buried in the white cemetery, Pine Hill Cemetery, rather than the African American Baptist Hill Cemetery. To this day, Gatsy's grave is the only African American grave in Pine Hill Cemetery to be marked with a headstone. This marker represents not only herself, but the several other enslaved people who were buried near her, some of which were dug up and were thrown away to make a new road. The reason for her wish to be buried in Pine Hill Cemetery is still unknown, though there are multiple speculations, one of which is that her husband was buried there. During this time period, African Americans would often request to be buried in white cemeteries because they had family members who were buried there before a black cemetery was created. Another speculation is that she wanted to be buried along with all the people she worked for, since the majority of them were white. This speculation was made by the white population because they likely wanted to tell a narrative that minimizes the brutality of enslavement and supports an ideology of white supremacy. Although unknown, the first speculation is likely more probable because Gatsy was known as the widow in her community, suggesting a close bond to her spouse. This leads us to believe that Rice would likely want to be buried near her husband who passed away before the establishment of Baptist Hill Cemetery, and therefore was buried in Pine Hill. Gatsy Rice's success of moving from enslavement to a free, successful, working African-American woman is an inspiration to all who hear her story.
The video you just watched was one of 20 presentations created by a group of 11th graders at Auburn High School and in collaboration with Auburn University and the larger community. It is absolutely amazing what our youth can accomplish when they're motivated in a meaningful way. My name is Dr. Robert Bubb, and I am a lecturer in the Human Development and Family Sciences Department at Auburn University. I am also the coordinator for Our Past, the research to preserve African American stories and traditions. Now, as a coordinator, I try to identify and enable resources for the community to preserve our sacred spaces and our sacred stories. And now, today's presentation has 2 parts. In the first part, we're going to discuss a problem in our educational system, mainly that a significant portion of American history is either missing or it has been silenced. We will also discuss a possible solution, in that history can be told by our youth in an inspiring way, through the lives lived by those who came before us. We can teach facts and dates about civil rights and housing discrimination, Or we can talk about Blanche Carter's resilience as she fought for African American housing rights in Auburn. The emotional story will always be more memorable and inspirational than the facts and dates memorized for a test, which are then quickly forgotten. The second part of our time together will be a reflection on what was learned through this collaborative process. It'll also be an opportunity for us to share our tips on how you can be a resource in your community to preserve your sacred spaces and your sacred stories. But first, we should probably do some introductions.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Halprin. I'm a U.S. history teacher at Auburn High School in Auburn, Alabama. I've been teaching for 6 years, and this is my second project working with Dr. Robert Bubb and Dr. Terrence Bickerstaff on local African American history with our secondary students in Auburn.
Hello, my name is Dr. Terrence Bickerstaff, and I am elated to be with you on today. Why am I elated to be with you on today? Because we are inviting youth to discover local African American history. We are inviting them to become part of the process of researching and caring and curating the African American history and the African American story within a community, within a family, around an individual. And it is incumbent upon us to be excited about it as we tell and share a story so they can get excited about it as well. And on today, as we discuss a little more about connecting community to share the sacred story, we are reminded, I am reminded, that each of us have a story. And that story is connected to another story. And that story is connected to a family. That story is connected to an organization or an entity. That story is connected to a school and a church. And that story is connected to a larger community. And it is in the weaving of that story, in the fabric of that communal tapestry, that we are bound together. And it is in the telling of those stories, it is in the sharing of those stories that we are reminded how sacred those stories are and how sacred the spaces are that those stories are connected to. You are here because you're wanting to connect a younger generation to a community and to a community story, whether they were born in that community, whether they just grew up, they moved to that community and grew up in that community, or whether they just moved there and they're interested in what's going on in that community. It's a local story. That's everybody's story, but it's a shared sacred story. And it's the story of individuals. It's the story of families. It's the story of communities. And in many ways, we are tied together, whether we want to be or not. But it's in the sharing of those stories that we understand our truth, and we use that truth to speak to power. Those in the community are vitally important as they are the subjects of the story. Those families, those individuals, those organizations, that sacred ground, that cemetery, that church, that school, those are the subject of the stories. These are the stories that we're passing on. And you are a part of a unique group of storytellers, curators of family, individual, and community histories. You are a part of the group of griots and jalis who are sharing and singing the community's history, but sharing and singing it from a place of knowledge, from a place of energy, and from a place of wanting to make sure that it's shared because of the caring and the curating that has to go on in storytelling and in the sharing of sacred narrative. And it's in the binding together of us around the sacred narrative that we come on today. And we come today because we're wanting to include a unique group of people that are critical in the sharing of the story, but not only in the sharing of the story, but in the research of the story, not only in the research of the story, but in the continuation of the story. And those are our young people. Those are our young people. Those are our school-age children. Those are our middle and junior high school students. Those are our high school and our college students. Those young people who are interested in hearing about what happened, why it happened, who did it happen to, and how did it turn out, and how they can learn from these stories. But these stories cannot be captured if we don't work as a team. My life is deeply embedded in the story that is about 185 25 years old in one community, a story of my family that came from Georgia to East Alabama, cleared the dense wilderness of East Alabama, and helped build a town, but didn't stop there because I am still here. I am still a product. I am still bearing witness and producing because of them and their story. And so it's a part of us understanding how we're embedded in the story as to why we need to connect others to the story. And so as we make these partnerships with our youth, with our educators, with our local universities, with our local preservation societies, these are the people that can help us and assist us in pulling our youth into a space and us creating a space where they feel as if these stories belong to them. And to be able to have a group of young people that can carry and care and curate my family's story along with me, because we're not handing it over. What we're doing, we're pulling them in.
This is a great honor for my grandparents in recognition of their contribution to the community over a century ago. To be able to provide a resting place for African Americans whose families could not afford to bury them was indeed an act of unselfishness, kindness, generosity, and love. Your research and essays have been above excellent. I know my grandparents are watching with a big smile on their face, full of love, gratitude, and thanks. I'm so proud to be their granddaughter. Thanks again, and best wishes to all of you.
I know that I have personally felt that welcome to the fold, be part of the community, and to be a part of these amazing stories. I always make it a point to counsel our youth that the stories we work on are not our stories to do with as we please, and to as much as possible that we allow ourselves to be taken in by the story. Now, for me, becoming part of this wonderful community has filled a void in my own sacred family that I never really knew was missing. Now, my grandfather, he would always rub his hand. And he would always rub his hand when he was thinking. And so I remember once, probably about 7 years ago, when someone was absolutely incredulous about my grandfather's African ancestry. And as my grandfather sat there rubbing his hand, I could tell that he was thinking of how to respond. But he never did, right? He never spoke. He didn't say anything. He just sat there and he remained silent. And maybe it's because he didn't know how to respond. I don't know, but it was his silence that I always remember. It is this silence that's the problem. And it's being silenced, right, by others or situations or other things. That's the problem. And our youth are the ones who pay the price for it. So a significant portion of American history is missing. It's the history that built America. As Dr. Bickerstaff stated, locally, it's the history that built Auburn, Alabama, beginning in the 1830s. The Black experience is American history, and it's absent from our curriculum. And so although the university student learning objectives include diversity and inclusion, most major programs do not have a significant diversity requirement. In many cases, diversity and inclusion courses are electives, and that includes this HFS 4950 course that we're talking about today. And it's typical that this topic is not integrated throughout the curriculum. So how is it that our graduates are going to develop meaningful interactions if they do not know history? And so we send them out into the workforce, or even send them out to interact with the local community, and they're sent out there at a disadvantage. And that's the problem that we're trying to address with this collaborative effort.
From a secondary teacher's point of view, teaching local African American history can pose a logistical problem as well. According to Alabama's course of study for grades K through 12, students only receive 1 year of Alabama history in 4th grade. The span of U.S. history, from founding to modern day, is covered twice, in 5th and 6th grade and 10th and 11th grade. That means, for example, high school students only cover the significant hallmarks of Alabama's civil rights movement once in their academic career. For teachers facing the pressure of fitting their entire scope and sequence into the course of the school year, Teaching these events meaningfully becomes a major challenge. Even for teachers who want to devote more than a passing reference to African American history, adding a lesson on African American history can seem tacked on or rushed. Whether teachers realize it or not, students pick up on the hurried and unrelated nature of the topic and absorb the message that African American history is simply an add-on to their course, or worse, an unimportant lesson. There is not a concerted effort to make local history a part of our classes. Therefore, students at best find the lessons they learn about American history far removed and unrelated to their own lives.
So to develop a possible solution to teach African American history, we needed an end goal that would make history relevant to both the university and the high school students' own lives. We also knew we couldn't, nor should we in any way, do it by ourselves. So by partnering with those in the community, the students we knew would become part of these sacred stories, and that these sacred stories would be part of them by the end of the semester. So we decided as an end goal that the students would virtually present their stories to the community. This high stakes goal took the stories beyond the classroom, made the projects meaningful while motivating students and making a difference in the community. So it was about 2 years ago when we collaborated with the junior high school students on a similar project. And just recently, one of the junior high school students' parents emailed me and stated that his daughter still goes out to maintain the grave of the person she researched. And I think that embodies the lasting impact that we want to have with our youth. We agreed for a class on Fridays, so 5 Fridays during the semester. We then, in partnership with those in the community, identified 10 stories or projects for the university and high school students to work on. The community members read and they edited the student drafts and provided comments. Now, the university course itself met every Monday to discuss readings and to plan for Friday meetings with the high school students. But first, before anything else, the university students had to learn some local African American history and then also learn how to find and interpret historical records. So the university students, they read the book Lest We Forget, A History of African Americans in Auburn, Alabama, and also the book The Saga of the Muses. And those were their foundational readings going into the course. Of course, they also had to research online and in books and also learn how to use genealogical websites such as FamilySearch and to post documents back to FamilySearch. And they also interacted with the community members on top of all that. After all that, they had to go to the high school classroom and teach what they learned. Now, editing of the drafts compelled the university students to learn collaboration skills with both the high school students and the members of the community. It also allowed them to develop their writing and presentation skills. And then finally, several of the projects advocated for change in the larger community, such as an outdoor classroom for teaching African American history, and a memorial park, and also a justice center.
Working with the high school students has been a great opportunity for me, just getting to know them and teaching them about historical documentation. And they have been a joy to work with, very enthusiastic, wanting to learn more. And this class is a great addition to the Auburn University, and I think it's going to be around for a while. And learning about the untold contributions of African Americans in Auburn University. And through this class, I've also been able to learn more about my family history in itself.
I had the privilege of being able to mentor some amazing AP US history students from Auburn High School as we planned a centennial event for Robert Frazier. I chose to help them plan this event because once I heard who Robert Frazier was, I decided he needed an event that was as uplifting and inspirational as he was.
My experiences with the AP students at Auburn High School has been extraordinary. As we reviewed the life story of Blanche Carter, an activist for housing and equal rights in Auburn, we discovered that there was more to the story than what the eyes can see. Blanche was a caring mother, loving wife, preacher and teacher of righteousness, and to me, she was one of the frontline foot soldiers in the fight for equality in Auburn. I will cherish the memories and moments from my work with those magnificent AP students at Auburn High School.
During the semester, I taught 6 U.S. history courses to 11th grade students, 5 courses of AP U.S. history, and 1 course of on-level U.S. history, Reconstruction to Present. The courses were face-to-face, though at times students were quarantined because of COVID protocols, and for those times, they used WebEx to log into class virtually. They worked in groups of 2 to 6 for this project. At the outset, I had a few learning objectives in mind for the project. The first goal was historical document analysis. From the documents that Dr. Bubb and his university students provided, I wanted my students to be able to analyze the information provided by genealogical records, court documents, newspaper accounts, and photographs. My students would practice the art of contextualization, by which they would apply what they were learning in the U.S. history curriculum to explain how those original source documents were created. For instance, as we learned about the history of sharecropping in the Reconstruction period, my students were better able to interpret census records that explained why families were listed as farmers, yet rented the land and had no formal education training. Our discussion of lynching as a form of racial terror used in the post-Civil War period helped students to interpret the racially charged language of newspaper accounts of lynchings in our local county. Another one of my goals for the project was having students practice the process of writing history themselves. Too often, my students struggle with only memorizing historical facts, not seeing history as stories that are written by authors with explicit and implicit agendas. Having students participate in the process of constructing a narrative from the historical record was vitally important in having them understand the complex process of writing history. One of the key parts of presenting this project to my students was the fact that this would not simply be a classroom project for a grade. From the beginning, I told students that their work would be presented in front of a community audience. This motivated them as they realized that their work would be seen by the descendants of the people whose stories they were telling. It encouraged students that their work was more than a course requirement. It would make a difference in the community. Students were a little in awe that their stories and proposals for local Auburn parks would be seen by the leaders of our city. They became excited to think about how their work could impact their local community. This high-stakes, authentic learning that was taking place pushed students to put forth even more effort.
And that when you're writing about history, you can't just write it once and then be done with it. You have to go back and make multiple revisions on your writing to make sure every word is historically accurate and that you include all the details in the story.
In class, we were learning about the Reconstruction period and about Jim Crow laws and segregation and all these civil rights issues that were going on during the time period, and it really helped me be able to truly understand what he was going through, what he had to face, all the discrimination and the terrible comments, and it was just easier for me to finally realize truly what happened.
I learned how to read census records, and I figured out how poorly they were kept up with back then, but thankfully we had Dr. Bubb to help us read them and analyze them to make sure we get all the facts right.
Yeah, so with this project, I was finally able to put a face with the name. We hear a lot of stories about segregation, about slavery, about mistreatment of African Americans, and typically in the classroom, we just think of them as stories, but through this project, I was actually able to see a picture of a person who lived a life here in Auburn and to say, I now know the story of this person. I know the place that this happened. I know the areas that this happened, and it became a real life thing for me so that it's no longer just something I read about in history. It's a legit thing that actually happened, and it opened my eyes to that.
It wasn't really just a project where I can get a good grade. It was more about helping the community as well to benefit, so they can benefit from the history and learn what they can do to make the future better.
One of the things I liked about the project is working with the college students. Normally at high school, we're just working in our grade and know other people, but bringing in another age perspective, 4+ years ahead of us, they have more knowledge and they're older and they have a different view than what we have, and it's nice to comprehend and talk about and figure out solutions with not just your age group.